I'm here today with James Heckman, professor of economics at the University of Chicago and a Nobel laureate. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Rob. Always.
We're talking about something that's quite interesting, a profession which analyzes the incentives of people, now turning to analyze the incentives of its own profession. And you led a panel today at the ASA meetings and brought these things to the surface, and it was quite a vibrant panel. You had Angus Deaton, Drew Fudenberg, George Akerlof, Lars Hansen, and yourself, and it was quite vibrant.
Yes, I think we could have gone on for hours, to be honest, and if we'd engaged the audience, we probably would have had even better engagement. We just didn't have the time. But I was surprised and pleased that so many people had taken this question about incentives economics is offering its young and creating the next generation, how it's creating, destroying, or shaping what's going to be done in the next 10, 20 years. I was surprised how much enthusiasm that each of these senior scholars felt about the importance of this question and their views that we really should think deep and hard about how we can go forward with a better way to incentivize our young.
I noticed everyone caring about the profession.
Yes, for sure.
Everyone feeling quite passionately in some respects, and you differed a little bit, but by and large, a passion that things were out of line at the present, and it had to do in large part with the constriction of the idea space that can be explored successfully by young scholars, and also the what you might call the fatigue and the wear and tear of submitting to this process. All of these different dimensions were explored, but it was quite fascinating. You yourself started with a series of charts, and you talked about
we can put those online if you want.
We'll put those on as part of this conversation. We can embed them in, that people can see things like how the top 5 journal impact factors exist in a 2, 5, and 10-year framework, or what you referred to in, I don't know how to say this, but how the different journals affiliated with different schools tended to publish more for their home team.
A home bias, you might call it in trade theory, but it's a more general phenomenon, that's correct.
And so it raises the question about what is being measured.
Right.
I thought it was fascinating. Some of the members of the panel had been editors or had been referees frequently.
Correct.
And talked about that you're not dead sure that something is excellent just because it's in a top 5 journal. So if you don't read the paper and you just use the measure, you just use the indicator as a proxy for quality, you may be off course.
Correct. And I think also, at least historically, I mean, Rob, you and I have discussed some of these issues in the past, but just to kind of bring it to the audience on this question, was the publication of papers in macroeconomics, for example, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when the so-called rational expectations revolution came along. Initially, the people who were pushing that line of work couldn't get their papers in anywhere. And then the JPE was very much supportive of that, and I think kind of opened and new journals were founded that actually did promote that line, whatever you think about the line.
Yeah, remember the Carnegie-Rochester series?
The Carnegie-Rochester series was
purpose.
Exactly designed for that purpose. But then, as I think many people admit, I think you were talking about without mentioning names, that they themselves ossified because they would not tolerate dissident journal notions different from their own mainstream point of view.
When I started INET, I spoke to someone who's a Nobel laureate who will remain anonymous.
Yes.
And he said, "You were an undergraduate at MIT. I remember when those guys tried to stop us from getting jobs and stop us from getting published. And now the ball's in our court, and you're right, it's tribal.
Yes.
But it didn't start with us. We didn't invent this tribalism."
Well, maybe not, but the point is that there is tribalism, and it's not just in macroeconomics. It's actually been in a lot of fields where new ideas, and this is what was frightening, I think, about the discussion today and the realization. This, by the way, the views you heard were not coordinated in any view. I never asked. I sent around a few papers, but what actually was done was basically each person reacted to my questions. I had a set of questions about what the health of the profession was, very general. And they arrived at conclusions that were somewhat different, but nonetheless supportive of a general line. And I think the view is somehow that we are not really, we're incentivizing people to be number 2 or number 3, doing the cleanup, something really fundamentally new. Like George Akerlof was a little bit modest in saying, but his paper is a legend.
Yeah.
The Lemons paper got rejected by everybody.
I think 2 or 3 times. is
Two or
what I
three
think,
times, yeah. And then he finally published it in a journal that at the time was not that strong. And I think this is symptomatic. I noticed when Dale Mortensen got his prize in search theory a few years ago, many of his citations went to a journal that's far off the top 5, the International Economic Review. That's viewed as kind of, the bottom of the barrel. But what it did do was take papers in a very non-standard line, theory line, promote those papers, and at least let people put them out there, and they actually flourish. So places like the International Economic Review, the Journal of Labor Economics, and every counterpart, Journal of International Economics, and on, field journals. We're looking at some of the rankings, the World Bank Economic Review, which nobody would put as a top 5, turned out to be a major source of citations. Why? Because they had data, they had ideas, and then later, people built on those ideas. But what kind of field are we going to be if we say, oh, the creative people aren't going to get published, they're not going to get promoted, but the follow-up people, the cleanup acts, are the ones who get promoted? There's value in that, and I'm not denying it.
Confirm a tradition.
Yes, you confirm a tradition, and then you build in a kind of conservatism. If something is already caught on, then you can follow up and refine it. There's value in that. I'm not saying there isn't value. But I would say, and I think this point was raised by Lars Hansen about the cleanup point, I think that's something to document, to try to find out in each of these surges, lots of fields. Paul Krugman, for example, is an example. He described in some interview that I saw years ago, where initially some of his basic studies on trade and geography were rejected left and right. He couldn't get in anywhere. And then finally, he broke through. He had a book, with Heckman, and he also had, but initially there was a huge amount of resistance. And I would bet it's true of every big idea in economics.
Probably.
And, we were hearing about, Crick and Watson on DNA today from Fudenberg. But I think more generally that everything that's fundamentally new is weird.
It can be unfamiliar, and therefore you don't pass it because you don't know how to assess it.
Right, exactly.
It feels risky.
Exactly.
Or it can affect the validity of standing views of your peers or yourself that are quite threatening.
Though I have some personal experience. I'm a co-editor of the Journal of Political Economy. And so my experience there has kind of troubled me in some sense. I get referee reports on papers, and people will say, there's no new methodology in this paper. They will say, so you cannot accept the paper. Wait, I say, is there an idea there? I mean, is there a new finding? And so the view is it had to, or the methodology was wrong. Not really wrong, not an error being demonstrated, but just wasn't in the tradition of the masters, such as they had before. So what I find as an editor, a co-editor really, the chief editor is Harold Uhlig, is this sense of people, the referees themselves, feeling that we have to go along with what's usual. So, and it's a very hard thing to do. If an editor gets 4 referee reports and 3 of the 4 or 4 of the 4 say reject, then you're going to say, no, I'm going to still go forward with it. I've done that. But I'm telling you, you get howls from the referees as you're ignoring us. And it also requires work, which is another issue. You really do. There's something to be said when the referees do not understand it, which means it has to be stated more clearly, the paper. But nonetheless, but it's a big burden on editors and referees to think creatively.
And Professor Deaton made a very good point in the second go-around today, which is all of this debate is taking place in a back room where no one can see it or hear it.
Correct.
That if we actually debated the strengths and weaknesses of the papers out there online, young people would learn more, people could enter the controversy, they could, we could say, riff off the variations in the conversation, and the creativity collectively would be fostered.
I was president of the Econometric Society a few years ago, and as such, one of the issues that I tried to bring to the journal Econometrica, which is one of these famous top 5 journals, was the notion of an online forum, which would require some screening. So you wouldn't want cranks just to send in obscenities or something, but to actually comment on papers, to say, I can do better, make a technical supplement. This is what, there are profiles like this, there are precedents in other fields where you can have these kinds of online journals. So I thought this would be a very good idea to sort of, and the editors, a lot of the people sitting around the table that day, without mentioning names, were really quite negative. So the idea of this open science, which to me is the essence of really good science, and really the only way you're going to make forward progress, was stifled. And I think it was viewed as bureaucratic, and it would be. There'd be a lot of cranks saying, I don't like this guy, I don't like this. So some work could be required, but think of the benefit that would come, not just at the Econometrica, but every one of these journals.
And one of the other things that was discussed, I think again by Professor Deaton, you can have referees acting constructively.
Correct.
If they're relieved of duty of being, you might call the goaltender.
Yes.
And their job is to say, what would make this paper better?
Correct.
They can play a very constructive
Exactly.
role.
So as long as it's not a binary decision saying, this is up or down. And many people say this is not a top 5 paper. This looks more like a field journal. It's their assessment of whether or not this replicates what's already out there, rather than asking, is this a basically new idea? So I think you're right. Bringing in the referees in such a way that they can constructively engage the paper, and maybe even get some credit for it by publishing a rejoinder. I mean, that's not unprecedented. Yes. In the past, there have been economics papers where people, one of the famous papers, I don't know if you remember this, it's a book actually, the NBER, years ago used to have this great tradition of having each book refereed and had to be approved by the board. It turned out when Milton Friedman and Simon Kuznets wrote their book on the income from independent professional practice, they had the theory that the reason why doctors' incomes were so high was because of unionization, and because this is a famous Friedman paper. And one of the persons, actually, I've forgotten his name now, C. Reinhold Noyes was his name. He was a member of the board of directors of the NBER. He was head of the Reader's Digest, so he had he wrote a rebuttal. If you read the rebuttal, what does he have? This is 1945. He has a rebuttal saying, look, that may be true about monopoly, but there's also something else that they've missed, ability bias. The ones who go into, because they were only comparing doctors with people who weren't doctors. So one of the reasons was maybe doctors are smarter. So long before any econometrician was working on this question, C. Reinhold Noyes was. So I think it's this kind of open engagement where people say, this is an idea, we should vet it, and then kind of get feedback.
And there are many dimensions to this. The encouragement of young people, or the fostering of the most talented young people. But this goes much more broadly into our society, where research assessment exercises in many continental European countries, in China and others, are playing top 5 journal scorecard.
Yes.
Not saying how good is the paper the person wrote, what kind of mind, but take that number, that recipe number. I see lots of deans, and I've talked to people about this as INET has investigated. They say, we're threatened by lawsuits when we turn people down. We need objective measures of why someone should get tenure or not. So we go along with the journal 3-star, 5-star, multiply by the number in each category, and that's your score. And
now, I can understand. That's a good economic argument there, trying to avoid lawsuits and scrutiny. And it's true, it's more costly to try to screen papers on an individual basis and trying to screen candidates. And there really is an issue. It's a big debate. It's a big debate, not just in American education. We say, should we allow principals to have more discretion, or should we basically have criteria that are objective, or students for that matter? One of the most interesting findings that's come out in terms of students' assessments is that many people have thought, well, the standardized test for students is a much better policy than, for example, grades, because grades are subject to bias and all that. But it turns out that grades turn out to be much better predictors of later life outcomes and even success of who goes on to college for, say, high school students. And so there's a danger. But the fact is that grades in this case are, there are multiple teachers. So you could even say, let me toss out the bottom 5%, the top 5%, and come up with an average. You can do some protection. But use of that private information, bringing it in a way that survives scrutiny, so it isn't just bias. I think it has some value. It's an additional piece of information.
I mean, metrics, as long as they're an accurate representation of what you want to produce, are okay.
It is,
but we have to fight about that. We have to iron out the wrinkles in that.
We know, it's the famous story in incentive theory in economics about the 1,000-pound nail, right? In the Soviet Union. If you want to produce nails, and at one point they were producing one, I'm sure it was never true, but one 1,000-pound nail, because it was a lot easier to make one nail of a huge size. Useless. So I think people do respond to incentives. And that's why, as your remark at the beginning of this conversation was made, I think it is ironic that we are not studying our own incentives. And it's a great thing to study. Yes. The incentives that young economists face and the distortions. We all know that these, what's it called, multitasking problems. So if people are, if you have multiple goals you're trying to achieve, creativity, productivity, and if you only reward one of those, productivity is measured by some journal count, or in particular journal count, you're going to get that. I mean, it's just basic human logic. It's a whole gaming system. And so I think we have to recognize, we have to read our own papers more closely and recognize what the consequences of that will be.
I'm impressed with the quality of the scholars, reputation of the scholars who got on stage today. And as you said, there are many more. It is, how do I say, so helpful. A rebel organization like INET mounts this challenge and people become more defensive. When leaders who are known to have succeeded and care and are constructive are on stage like you were today, I think it creates tremendous potential for opening. How would you suggest INET, when I say augment or get behind the kind of effort that you launched today?
Well, I think, for example, my understanding is there may be a special issue of a leading journal, the one that was actually #1 in the citations I put, a Journal of Economic Literature. They may encourage that with a broader range of people, maybe representing people of different backgrounds. But we still want senior scholars who are above, who are not going to be feeling they're going to lose their next paper at the top 5. So I think that's one initiative to kind of encourage it, and then to encourage maybe more empirical research, looking into the different dimensions. Like we were talking, even a project where we looked at one revolutionary idea, to take Krugman, like we were saying. Where did Krugman first publish this work? What happened? What's the trail? So actually look at a path of creation and then find out how long did it take for the profession to acknowledge that there was something there, and then how long did it really take to get a lot of sites for something that was so brand new and so off the charts in some way. So I think documenting that a little better and doing it on papers that I think everybody would agree were fundamental papers. Nobody's done it. I mean, there's actually no incentive to do it, I guess. I think in a symposium like this, at least you'd get, I don't know if the JEL counts as top 5, but the participants we would think participating in that conference would actually be above the concerns in that regard. But I think putting out more empirical research on this, and then also channeling more talent into this incentive question. I mean, I suppose you could give a prize for, does economics have distorted incentives? And how do these change? And then what bodies, see, the interesting challenge that I think is harder is finding what kind of work are we not getting out? So, for example, one thing that has shown up a lot is economic history has suffered a big beating. And economic historians are typically slow to get things out. They do these large scholarly studies. The tenure clock works against them, and the publication journal counts against them. I mean, this literally, you're not going to get a 500-page study out.
Gestation period is just
gestation, and the top 5 doesn't include books. So you write a masterful book, and first of all, a lot of people aren't reading books. So the whole, so the incentive has changed in that regard. I've talked to some groups at foundations. I know I had a meeting with some people at Sloan Foundation a few years ago, and they were concerned about the fact that the incentives for young academics were somewhat distorted, for big projects were distorted. So I don't think they ever followed through with it. But the idea was to provide some incentives for scholars who were working on long-term projects to stay with those projects, at least to finance them in terms of getting research and getting maybe a base in a university where they could work on it. They couldn't guarantee tenure, though, from this, and I think that's really the question. But again, I keep thinking that if INET, and other groups in particular, but INET in particular is well posed to simply say, look, we can make people aware of this problem. This is not just a peripheral problem. And then maybe to follow through further what the consequences are, what has been deleted. Many people today mentioned the financial crisis, the meltdown.
The absence of looks at it.
But for the fact is, there were some people, like Ned Gramlich, when he was on the Federal Reserve Board, was writing about this, and it basically got stifled. And there were others who were writing about it, talking about it, but it was viewed as so fringe, and it was viewed so just impossible that having more liquidity out there and more markets and more possibilities to insure was so much against the mainstream that nobody would listen to it.
It's funny, Gillian Tett, who's the managing editor in the U.S. of the Financial Times, is a very good friend of INET. And when we started INET, she said to me, she's a PhD in cultural anthropology.
Okay.
She said, Rob, go study what's not said.
Yes.
Find the silences, because that will really reveal the contours of misaligned incentives and where power is that's deterring expression.
That's a great.
And
that's a great.
I thought it was a tremendous nudge.
Well,
to the
but
start of our
take, for
organization.
example, most recently, I think many people were surprised by the outcome of this election.
Oh, yes.
And of course, actually, it turned out that Angus Deaton, who was on our panel, his paper with Ann Case did provide some real
deep
basis for
insight.
insight into what
Yes.
was going on.
Yes.
But that, again, is something where you can actually say, okay, look, a problem manifests itself. It's not just the financial crisis, not just the Trump vote, it's not just to maybe go back in time and say, where did we fail in this regard and what prevented us from doing it? And I think what will come out of that analysis is multiple things. It's not just the top 5. It's also this larger conservatism where people say, I'm going to do business as usual. Oh, look, many people say, I go to graduate school. I mean, the average academic learns a set of tools. They keep the set of tools. They have every incentive not to renew those tools once they get tenure. Some will go out consulting and cash in for the rest of their lives. Others will renew those tools. But the fact of the matter is, looking more broadly at what the incentives are to stay current and to find out where we missed. I love this idea of looking at holes. Holes would be, that's it.
Well, George Akerlof really emphasized the
Yes, he did.
counterfactual economics of what we don't see.
What we don't see, but you could actually measure that in a constructive way by looking at problems that were not anticipated.
And you can also look at the nature of what constitutes evidence.
Correct.
Because what you might call the tribal practices,
Right.
and they may be good, maybe the tribe's on target, but the tribal practices about what constitutes valid evidence and not can influence what people will study or leave aside.
Oh, for sure, but economics is particularly vulnerable to that. And it's vulnerable in the following sense, that if evidence is presented in a kind of, quote, anecdotal form, or say this is just descriptive, that is a killer at a lot of top journals.
Not to be considered.
Not to be considered. And so the idea is everybody sees increasingly out in the profession, there's a view that the profession is kind of involved in a bunch of randomized trials. We want a true causal effect. And somebody describing, so, Adam Smith was really an anthropologist in his own way.
Yes.
And I would say Ricardo in his own way. They were describing phenomena using simple economic models and analogies to describe it. I think that activity is substantially devalued. And I think I think the idea of what evidence is needs to be broadened. I think that's a big limitation. Yes. And right now we've gotten in the notion that it has to be, somehow a census data set. I'll give you an example that I think I found staggering. I was at a conference a few years ago, and this was on structural change. It was an econometrics conference primarily. So there's a group of very good econometricians, without singling out names, very good. And they were trying to detect whether or not there was structural change, in this case in financial markets, and some were looking at other forms of markets, but it was primarily some commodities markets and so forth. And so they had very sophisticated tools, so-called switching regression, Markov switching regression, very sophisticated tools. Some of them were Bayesians too. But then you came along and said, wait, you had auxiliary data here. So some of these were financial markets. So did I need a Markov switching model to tell me about the stock market meltdown in 1987 or the 2007? We had newspaper accounts, we had journalistic accounts. And I think the profession has had a real difficulty in trying to utilize all of these multiple sources of information, including observer reports. I mean, literally, you talk to people in the street, you start sitting a sense. What was interesting in this election cycle, if you look at some of the report in the New York Times, the one person who started convincing me that maybe Trump had a chance was David Brooks. And why? He put his column to the side for about a month and went out into the Midwest and into these areas and started talking about this soft underside, which nobody had talked about. These were called flyover. So but this was something that was so out of the charts.
There's these books like Deer Hunting with Jesus. Our friend Rob Duggar has showed me a number. The one by Hawkchild about the New Orleans.
Yes.
Anthropology of how people feel about the government. There's a study in Wisconsin.
Oh, for sure.
And so this evidence was hiding in plain sight. Serious scholars in other disciplines.
And there were these books like Men Without Work, and that book by Murray, that was a complement to Brooks's old book, Coming Apart, and then the Putnam book. So we saw, but Coming Apart was even more on target, because really talking about there was this group of people out there. But there was no numerical strength of it. He described it as a phenomenon, and it was interesting.
The scale of it was
But people
unknown.
just disregard it. Said it's out there. Well, people get used to it. Don't worry. It's business as usual. There's a huge bias. I mean, that's why rational expectations ultimately, as a descriptor, isn't such a great model, simply because we have this model of adaptive forecasts. Whatever happened last time will happen again, is generally what people think is the right strategy. Right.
We don't have that stationarity in
Exactly.
structure of society.
And I think that's what we need to understand, and then to build techniques that do it. So if you think about somebody trying to describe, I've actually worked on China and trying to look at what technical change is in China, how technological change. If you were to use 20-year-old data sets, it's a waste of time.
different structure of economy.
It's literally, it's much better to actually go to the sites in Shanghai and further in the interior to see what the technologies are, who is actually engaged, and what kind of investment is being made. And those anecdotal accounts are things that are viewed as what bankers do, what business school people do, and kind of on the side, but it's not what a real economist does. And I think that's embedded into our teaching and econometrics, and even, well, theory, not so much. I mean, there isn't much concern, but it's more anecdotal. And what George said, George Akerlof made the remark, when he was trying to write his book on fishing. Basically, exactly, he's saying that sometimes the papers are just buried under, here's a bunch of coefficients, no simple message came out. People were actually punished for making a simple message. Instead, they were technically correct in a way. That's not bad. But that's almost follow-up. That's refinement. The first round of ideas almost has to be crude. An idea is every little baby is born as an ugly little thing filled with blood, and so I think descriptions are of that nature, and I think we have to encourage them more.
I'll finish with Jeffrey Sachs. In 2009, I'd known him for a while. I used to be a practitioner in finance.
Right.
He came to me and he said, I feel ashamed to be an economist because I didn't know what a credit default swap was, and it proved to be very important and a very vulnerable thing. He said, Rob, when did you start thinking it was a problem? And I said, in the middle of 2007, July of 2007, I believe it was Fitch wrote a report about the proliferation of these credit derivatives and the concentration at the firm AIG. And so there were, as you say, people hunting, and I know you have taught me over the last couple of years about the difference between induction, deduction, and abduction. I always thought when you worked on early childhood development, abduction was going to be about kidnapping. But it's a methodological synthesis of how people work conceptually with data and bring a richer, more textured understanding to life.
But it's something that actually is economists have difficulty dealing with surprise.
Yes.
Ironically, it's learning. And see, for example, Bayesians will say, we know how to learn. But think about it for a second. If something completely unanticipated occurs, you don't know how to assimilate. There is some work where people are starting to say how, ultimately, Frank Knight has this great quotation from Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. It goes like this. The existence of a problem of knowledge is that the future is different from the past. The existence of a solution to the problem of knowledge is that the future is like the past. So we got to know how to use the past to project the future.
That reminds me of the coyote going off the cliff in Roadrunner. Looks down, but he doesn't know he's going to fall.
He doesn't know he's going to fall, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to exploring these issues with you more
Yes.
again in the future, but mostly I want to congratulate you today. You've been an innovative scholar, you've been a great leader, and you exercise that leadership and that innovation on stage today, and I think you care for and you help your profession by doing so.
Well, we do care for it, but everybody on that stage cared for
That's
it.
right.
I think a lot of people in the audience. So thank you, and I hope INET goes this direction and supports it strongly.
We will.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you very much.
Thank you.